These are the corniest corn muffins in all of the United States of Americorn. Or maybe Cornmerica. You let me know in the comments. Not only does it have cornmeal or polenta, corn starch, fresh corn, corn mash, whole corn juice, and corn cereal, I even made popcorn while listening to Corn. It turns out I only like a couple of their songs. Now the great thing about this recipe is that you can make it with fresh in-season corn or frozen corn. I tested this recipe a couple of times, and in case you're wondering, I did try to incorporate popcorn into the muffins, but I didn't like the texture. It kind of just like melted and disappeared. So I'm keeping it pretty close to Nancy Silverton's The Cookie That Changed My Life, where I first saw it. Now, this recipe and book is kind of insane in a good way. It's definitely extra, as you'll see. Now, these corn muffins aren't as sweet as I expected, but sweet corn muffins are a bit sacrilege in certain parts of the US, with the North preferring a little more sweet and the South preferring a little less sweet and more savory. I'm not here to ruffle any corn husks, but I think this corn muffin finds a nice balance between the two. If you like it more sweet, have it with the topping. And if you're like my wife, have it without. That's why I made both. I have to say that this is one of the more involved recipes that I have made, but they were so damn good I had to share it with you. So you tell me if it's worth it. Buckle up, grab some popcorn, and let's make these muffins.
Let's start by preheating the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm gonna ask you to prep the muffin tins first. It's just easier to get out of the way now. I know that there are wizards out there that can fold up parchment paper into these perfect squares, but I'm no wizard or warlock for that matter. I just fold up a piece of parchment a few times and draw out squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and I'll cut out the 18 papers I need. And I'm also going to be using these silicone muffin liners as well, which work great. I had more, but the kids got into a bunch of them and I never saw them again. So, like I said, I'll be using a bit of both. When using the parchment paper, I discovered that a slender tomato paste can help create the right muffin tin shape. Again, pre-made and silicone liners are perfectly fine. Next, I'm going to toast 250 grams of polenta or cornmeal. Like I said, this recipe book is super fancy, so she uses polenta, but cornmeal works fine. The difference is in the grind, with polenta being a little finer, which might give it a little less of a grainy texture. I'll place that on a small pan and toast it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes, moving it around a little bit halfway. While that toasts, I'll start husking the corn. For this recipe, you'll need about 5 or 6 cobs of fresh corn. If you're using frozen, that's about 2.5 to 3 cups. I'm going to suggest giving fresh corn a try, and you'll see why in a little bit. I like cutting the ends off just to make peeling it a bit easier. I do my best to get all those little hairs on the corn, which is actually called corn silk. With the corn prepped now, I have to grate the corn into a bowl using a corn creamer according to the recipe, but I'm just going to have to make do with my grater. This can get extremely messy, to be honest. The point is, we're using 5 of the cobs of corn to get a soupy bowl of corn juice and kernels. That's the point of using fresh corn, since we'll be boiling down the juice in a few minutes. But if you do use frozen corn, you can always use a fruit processor or blitz this into pieces so you can get as much juice as possible. I like to take the last piece of corn and just cut off the kernels because I want to make sure I have whole kernels inside for added texture. Once done, I just pop this into the strainer and separated the juice from the mash. Then set aside the mash because I'm going to add that into the batter a little bit later. Silverton's recipe calls for about 110 milliliters of corn juice, but I'm going to be upfront, and this time around I didn't measure. I just let it boil down into the corn pudding needed for the batter and used everything I got. On medium heat, I just move this around until it thickens up, and that's because of all the natural cornstarch in the corn, which will add more of a corn flavor, but also makes it for a more tender and moist muffin crumb, which is really nice. Watch the bubbles, that's the evaporating water, so keep an eye on this so it doesn't burn. This should only take about 4 to 5 minutes. I'll transfer the pudding into a large bowl. Add 375 milliliters of buttermilk, 145 milliliters of any neutral oil, I used grapeseed here, and 60 milliliters of honey. Don't skip or skimp out on this. This added sweetness is necessary in my opinion. And then I added 2 eggs. I like to crack and mix them up separately so that I know that they're properly mixed in, and then I'll whisk it all together to combine. Now, let's prepare the dry ingredients, starting with the flour. The original recipe calls for cake flour, which is a finer flour that already contains cornstarch. You can use regular all-purpose flour as is, but I'm going to make my own cake flour by replacing 2 tablespoons, or about 16 grams per cup of flour, with cornstarch. Since I'm using 380 grams of flour, or 3 cups, that means removing about 50 grams and replacing it with cornstarch. The purpose of the cake flour is to create a more tender crumb, but honestly, all-purpose flour works just fine. One reason I chose this method was to maximize the corn flavor by adding extra cornstarch. Since cake flour is finer, I also took the time to sift the flour to prevent clumps in the batter and ensure that the cornstarch is evenly distributed. This is easily done by putting some good old parchment paper on the counter or cutting board and using it to pick it up when we are done and putting it back into the bowl. With the flour ready, I'm adding 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and for the baking powder, I'm adding 1 tablespoon and 2 teaspoons. Now the toasted polenta. I'm going to mix it up, and in case you think I'm making southern style muffins, I just forgot to add the sugar until now, so I'm adding 180 grams of sugar and a big pinch of salt and giving it a good mix. Then the recipe calls to add the wet ingredients a bit at a time, which I believe is one way to prevent massive clumps from forming. One batch I made, my wife did complain about hitting a dry patch when she bit into one of the muffins, so take your time. Once that's nicely combined, add 1 cup of that corn mash, making sure to include as much of the whole kernels of corn as you like. Feel free to add a 1/4 cup more of whole corn, I think it can handle it, and texturally, it's really great when you bite into them. Now to prepare the topping, which is optional for some, but I really think it brings out a nice texture to the top of the muffin. Take 1 egg white, a 1/2 cup of brown sugar with some cinnamon, and mix that up, or just add the crushed up corn chex into it and give it a good mix. I tried it with corn flakes too, but I like the chex, and I think any cereal would do. Now to add the batter to the muffin tins. I just give them a quick spray with baker's spray so that they don't stick to the liners. I used a 1/3 cup measuring cup and scooped in a healthy portion. It got really messy at times, but I found this will rise nicely, and I like having big muffins, so try to get 1/3 of a cup in there if you can. You can see the rustic paper liners have a lot of folds compared to the silicone liners, which have none, which makes things a little more challenging, but the end result is pretty good. Once that's done, take a large tablespoon and spoon some of that gooey topping onto as many muffins as you like. I had enough to cover about 2/3 of the muffins, which I wanted both with and without the topping, but you can always double the recipe. Don't worry if the topping doesn't stay in the middle, it works really well when it spreads over the top. It's okay if it's a little messy. As a finishing touch, you can add 1 or 2 corn chex pieces as a crown. Now I pop them into the oven at 350 degrees for 20 minutes, and when that first bake finishes, rotate the muffin tins because sometimes ovens have hot spots. Then raise the temperature to 375 and bake them for about 15 minutes or until the tops are nice and golden brown and a toothpick comes out clean or with little crumbs. Once out of the oven, you can let it cool down for 5 to 10 minutes. What I like about the homemade paper liners is that they are easier to take out of the tin. The silicone liners baked up and onto the tin, so I'm taking a paring knife and running it around the muffins to free them from their prison and put all of them on a tray to cool down some more. That being said, don't be shy about putting in a good amount into the liners, especially the paper ones. They pop up and look amazing. These go great with some honey butter or regular butter. Enjoy.